This is the Literally Podcast. We're booked on 25th on historic 25th Street. Today, our guest is Ogden's first Poet Laureate, Brad Roghaar. And he's going to start by reading a few poems to us, then we'll talk. So we'll listen to a few of Brad's poems.
Okay, well, here's a recent poem that I have. We all hurt, and this is a poem about comfort. I've recently become fascinated with a couple of things, comfort and in a very real sense, and forgiveness. So this is one of the poems that has to do with comfort. It's a poem about safe spaces and the words that should fill them. It is a poem about listening to small voices. It's a poem about what we can choose to do. It's a poem about providing. So I hope you like it. What a small voice, at once lost, might tell us. Subtitled, Provide. Dark nights, we all have them. But at those times, when they bleed into day and become indistinguishable, how can we believe they will ever leave us? Any small creature caught and alone will begin to chew. We forget about a river's bank, how it gives to what must be a terrifying erosion before it becomes its new self, shining in the comfort of its water speak. We are strange creatures, how our need for others never waxes nor leaves. We all remember how we once needed to hear a particular voice, though we could not name it, and how we waited for it in that dark. Sometimes this is our miracle, to hear that voice, or more, to speak the voice to another. Alone will find its wanted place. We need not help it to our own. If we were not so closed, could we not know loneliness in some other way? Would we not then burst open in our own appointed season? Would we not be whole, both provider and provided for? Who are we to miss even one single flower wishing to bloom? Let there be more than commerce between us. Let us talk one to another. We should not cover our windows at night, no thin and makeshift blanket of convenience. Let us make our reach warm and heavy with words. We sometimes believe there are no words that will do, that all rivers pass by all too quickly. But this is not true. Always the words pool around our tongues, open. Let us provide the soft, still pools in the river. This is a poem. Actually, I'm kind of entranced with the way lizards hold their bodies in that little peculiar motion and test the air. And I just was fascinated with how they go about their business and how we think our business is so terribly important sometimes. So this is a very short poem, actually, but it's called Somewhere in the Desert. Somewhere in the desert, a lizard tests the air. It stretches high from a sudden push of its forelegs, motionless for a moment, poised in that peculiar sideways curve that only lizards do. A thin, translucent film slides like the skin of a grape from its dark, wet eye, the oversized orb that just now, in its sudden dryness, feels the cooling air of the desert night. Far away, and at this moment, the liquid eye of the lizard misses you as you go about your small and petty business. I have one here. It's a little older one as well. It's from my book, my first book, and but I just recently was invited to Shanghai in China to read poems at the University, the Shanghai Normal University, and they particularly like this one. So I'm thinking about it now, and here it is. So let me. I think they liked the metaphors in it, or I don't know why they liked it. Who knows why people like anything. But this is a poem about change. Change appears very easy sometimes, but we know that it's usually more difficult. And this is called Coming Clean with Age. I should say, too, I want to skip forward because this is the fall, and this is a springtime poem. This is a poem when you look out on the grass and the snow is melting in Utah, and you see the little green tendrils of grass kind of coming up through the melting snow, and always a great time in Utah, spring and fall. Winter, we can do without summer, but there we go. So the poem is, This is How Grass Grows. It looks easy, the languid, lazy birth of grass, a rubbery green offspring appearing as it does, sudden, through the stubborn patches of melting snow, as random as spilled pepper on a white tablecloth. But if we dare to listen, to place a naked ear to that cold-covered spot of dampened dirt, we will hear the movement of each particle of soil, the grudging making way for the upstart shoot. What already is does not give way easily to what wants to be. And if we dare to thrust our hands beneath the thin, crusted shell of dying ice and rest our fingertips on the earth, as comfortably as a pianist caresses a familiar key, we will feel the insistent, violent vibrations of birth. And the pitch will resonate in the blood, deep within the capillaries at the farthest point from the heart, our heart, where we want so many things to be, what we know they never will be. If we dare to kneel to press our naked flesh and hold it close and hard against the fecund soil, we will recognize what we already know, what our heart would like to hide. Birth is change, and nothing changes easily. Hold, press hard, and listen. What we hear is the deep mother moan of earth, the pain of change, as the turgid tendrils of new spring grass thrust themselves, impertinent and impatient, cesarean, through the hard, white, and pregnant belly of winter. I can do a newer one as well. One of the few poems that I use an I in for some reason. I usually avoid the I, but I couldn't really get this because it's too presumptuous. So without having an I in it, so there you go. It's called, as I said, recently I have been interested in forgiveness for some reason, the whole idea of things retrieved. So, coming clean with age. Okay, it's time to come clean, paired to the truth, like a white slice of apple held under the cold runoff of a kitchen tap. I have not come to what I could be, have not opened my own ribs and offered up a beating viscera that seems even close to a metamorphosis of beauty, or even an approximation, a flower in bloom. When I was young, I was young. What more can be said of that? We are all lacking, brought up short. We often do no good. But nothing comes close to the abandonment of pity, the pity that love demands from all of us. Nothing is worse than hearing that call across loneliness and mistaking that voice as nothing but nothingness. I cannot say that I have not taken my pleasure being above it all, my own approximation of God, running across a desert floor on all fours, sniffing what I would and leaving what I wished. And let there be no mistake, there are things left dreadfully damaged, left like refuse in a plastic bag to heat and eat upon itself waiting for a puncture. But this might be far too harsh. Life opens in the same way, punctual and random, and reaching for air out of a bag of blood and salt. And more it holds, even in a desert. When we were young, we were young. What more can be said of this? I believe in forgiveness, the dark grave of the world resurrected, made new each morning, forgiven as bread to wheat, as juice to berry, the thrashings and the stompings, one thing made into another, everything forgiving the change far before it makes itself complete and ready to go again.
Confronting authors with real questions about the writing process, the difficult and disheartening publishing industry, and why anyone would choose to torture themselves in the world of writing, this is the Literally Podcast, with your host, writer, runner, and the literary voice of Ogden, Utah, Case Johnston. Exposing literature, the authors, the business, the process. The Literally Podcast.
I'm Case Johnston. I'm with Shane Griffiths, who I try to hoodwink into hosting as many as these as possible with me. And our guest today is Brad Roghaar, the first Poet Laureate for Ogden City. It's been a long time coming, and I think that as a committee electing Brad, I really don't think we could have done any better. And so we're really fortunate as a city to have a voice, poet, somebody who knows Ogden, somebody who's contributed to the Ogden arts for decades. We're at Booked on 25th on historic 25th Street. This is the Literally Podcast, and I'm going to start questions by asking Shane if she has any.
Oh, you're throwing me right off the bat. I've got all sorts of questions.
You want me
the
to start?
question is where to start. Well, actually, I want to start with something that Brad had mentioned and that hopefully didn't get lost in the shuffle. You said that as you get older, you write longer poems. And I was curious about that, if you'd noticed a shift, if you had a sense of what was calling you towards that desire to linger over something, or is it lingering? Is it something else?
Yes. Well, I think it is lingering in a sense, and I think it is. They lengthen out because I'm not sure of exactly what I want to say in them. Sometimes I'm not so sure of myself. I'm not so sure about a lot of things. I never wrote really short poems. I mean, I always, I was never bound to the 14 lines of the sonnet or any of those kinds of things. That seemed to me not my voice, so I did not work in it. Although I have written sonnets, I think everyone writes traditional verse, because how else do you compare yourself to the tradition or whatever? And I think that one always attempts to see what one can do with that, with those forms. But I find that just lengthier things, I almost let myself go someplace and then stop and say, wait a minute, I'll come back. And I don't feel like taking it out necessarily. I don't think it needs the compression that I used to think my poems needed. So I think it's following the way my mind wanders. The older I get, and maybe I should say lingers. I don't know if it wanders. My wife might say it wanders, but I think I'll just say that it lingers longer at certain places. A lot of poetry is just talking to yourself.
Right. Well, it's interesting because you said that maybe there's less urge towards compression, that you thought that the poetry, the lines still strike me as very compressed, and yet maybe go in more directions, or what is it? I'm like trying to put my finger on the ways in which they expand.
Yeah, I'm not putting a lot of words in those lines necessarily,
yeah.
unwanted or unneeded words, I don't think. In fact, I again find myself being much more blunt.
So a different kind of compression.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
But one that certainly allows me to think someplace else, and and then go ahead and go there and try to bring it back if I want, and not worry about it so much. I think that's the way people listen to poems anyway.
I'm glad Shane asked that. It's kind of the same question I was thinking about, was this idea of growth as a poet. And we talked a lot about already today within your poetry, and then with Shane's question, this idea of growing as a poet from a younger man to an older man. And it kind of catches me a little bit when we discuss, the difference between wandering and lingering in poetry, and when does wandering, the word itself, take on a connotation that's negative? I mean, I think as a younger man, if a teenager wanders through something, we give them credit. As we grow older, wandering becomes less positive, right? And as a wandering mind might be seen as something that's lacking instead of something that's growth. It's an experience of growth as we're younger. And so, looking at the poems that we read today, I'm thinking about the poem, the first one that you read with the pools, the last line of the, and you said you wanted to talk about it. I did too. I just was shutting my mouth. Let us become the pools.
Yeah.
Let us become the pools.
The title is "What a Small Voice That Once Lost Might Tell Us." Provide.
Right. And I think with that poem, and from what I heard, there's so much give and take. We want to be the voice that comforts others, and we want to hear the voice throughout that comforts ourselves. And the last line of "be the pools" in kind of, that settling of water and something that's around them that is quick and fast and maybe scary and so on and so forth. So I think I'm getting to a question. Watering. And so I think you've answered my question about growth as a poet. That maybe even as younger poets, they feel that they have to show confidence within their poetry, and maybe as a poet who grows, or as a writer who grows, the exploration is just as important, even if it's on the page.
Yeah. This is very much about words as well. I mean, it is let there be more than commerce between us. Let us talk one to another. Let's not hide behind things. Let us make our reach warm and heavy with words, because those are the things in which comfort comes. Maybe even more than a caress. I mean, they often carry more weight than that. It's what you say to someone rather than even what you're communicating through the physical nature of things. And sometimes, as I say, we sometimes believe there are no words that will do, but there are. There are words. We have words. We need to choose to use those, and they pool in ourselves, and that, of course, takes me back to my little pooling river, and I think, we need to provide those pools for those words to pool. And
to exist.
Yes.
To be there.
And doesn't happen, may happen by accident, but a lot of times it does not. We choose how we want to be with other people. We choose what we say to them. And we can choose a lot of different things, and we can hide behind not choosing something. And boy, we all need the voice. At least I think we do.
And I think that poem, and for me, a direct connection between that poem and the poem about forgiveness. Like you said, with words, we can choose them poorly, and we do a lot of times. And there was a poem within the poem about forgiveness, is that it starts to happen before it actually happens. It should, at least. That's what I took from a lot of it.
Yeah, that poem, just to say, I think it's a very ugly poem. It gets very ugly at a certain point, Can I say that I've not taken my pleasure being above it all? The things are dreadfully affected and wrecked by the things we do. And let there be no mistake about that. We need to know that. And and then when the whole image of a plastic bag then full of refuse, that just sits out in the desert and heats itself and waits for a puncture. That's pretty ugly up to that point. I mean, it's not what I will usually be writing. But that's why I like this poem, because the juncture is right there. The next line is, but this might be far too harsh. This whole thing may be far too harsh because life is that way. In fact, life comes out of a womb of salt and blood. And then it moves to, instead of when I was young, which is not me, but, that persona, it invites when we were young, all of us. And I can't not do that at that point, too, I think. And then you can get into what forgiveness really does do. It resurrects that world, and becomes, I think, a very hopeful poem, and not an ugly poem, but a very beautiful poem in the sense that forgiveness makes things beautiful, and without it, pretty sad. So, yeah.
I think I've got two related questions. I'm trying to decide which I want to ask first. I'll start with the nature question. Okay. So if I was to characterize your poetry, one of the things that that stands out to me is that you seem to be very drawn to natural subject matter. And so I want to hear more about that, but I also want to follow up on your comment that you don't often include the I voice in a poem, that you tend to resist that, because the other way I would characterize your poetry is to say that it has a very musical quality, and I'd be tempted to say lyric, except for that resistance to using I, which we tend to think of as one of the defining qualities of the lyric. So on the one hand, is there something about nature specifically that calls to you that asked poetry to be written about it? And then also, is that related to the suppression of the self, or is it something different that's going on there?
Yeah, I don't want to repress myself in the poem. Nature is just the vehicle in which you can communicate. I mean, I don't know. It's visual. It's around us. It's it seems to me the fodder for poetry. For at least the saying of poetry, the subject, but not the real subject, but the vehicle, I guess I want to say. And of course, I grew up around here. I mean, I grew up climbing and skiing and backpacking, and to me. It's meditative. It's all the things that the poetry is. So it's neo-romantic, perhaps, but I don't think I quite use it in the same way that the Romantics did. But I use it as a voice. I think that I don't like. I think one of the things early on, and I wanted when I started, I didn't want my poetry to be hard to understand. And that's easy to do. And you'll notice that I will often just kind of introduce a poem because it's not fair. Nobody has this in front of them. They're complex in a lot of ways, and nobody has it in front of them. And we're not used to just hearing this. And so I will give you hints of what's coming. When I read my poetry, I like to do that because if you have a hint of what's coming, then you'll grab a line. And if it's only one line, I tell people all the time, you can't, how can you love all of a poem? I mean, they're so complex, even small ones, and they're so big, and they have so much in them. And we have a paranoia about not, this is a poet saying something I don't understand, and there's a key that I have to unlock and find out the meaning of this whole poem. And I like to tell people, no, find one line, 2 lines, 3 lines that speak to you, that you see clearly and think you understand what that's talking about. Isn't that enough? I mean, it's enough for me. It's enough for me as a poet to have somebody pick up a line or two and remember it and think about it and ask about it or just keep it to themselves or whatever. And it's certainly enough for me when I'm reading poetry. I've read a lot of poetry. I've studied a lot of poetry, it's daunting. I mean, how do you understand all of Milton? You don't. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. So what you do is you grab a few lines that really speak to you, and you remember those, and they mean for you, and that's plenty. You know, to me, it's plenty in a poem. So the I part, it seemed at first pretentious to me, and I didn't want it to be like me. So I started talking in my poems to everybody. I'll use you and we in my poems all the time, rather than saying I think this and I think that and we. I'll just say we think this or you think this, or so I try to grab my reader by that too. Bring in a reader or into the poem right away instead of me, and that way I can talk. It's not an embarrassment to say anything about myself. It's just a considered way that I would rather sound. And so I'll do that. And you'll probably notice in these poems too, I want them to be understood. So sometimes I'll be going off on these metaphors and they are lyrics. I don't think I'm really telling a story in like a narrative piece. But sometimes as I'm getting lost in myself in these things that I'm creating, these metaphors and these things, I sometimes just say, well, just say it. Just come out and tell them. We are all lacking, brought up short. We often do no good. Just in case you're not getting this, there it is. You know, and that's the truth. And that's that apple pared clean as you can get it.
Right. Why withhold?
Yeah. And so I will do that in my poems if I think that they are being lost someplace. I think it's a strength. I like it. Yeah. I like it when people talk to me straight like that. I think there's lots in it we can explore that I don't have to say, but I do like sometimes. It is what I think I often do in much of my poetry is I will actually come out and say. The thing is to make that lyrical, to make it sound right. You know, so that it's not like pedantic something, but that it fits in the cadence of the poem. And the cadence of poems to me are just what I hear. And hopefully, I'm not sure people will read them the same way I do, but hopefully they'll hear me read them. I love to read them. I'm not worried so much about, I'm just worried about the cadence. How does it sound to me? I mean, does it sound like it flows through something and that that's the music in it, not the meter, obviously. It has something to do with the white spaces and the spaces that you choose to break on, obviously. But I think most poets have a voice. I mean, you read Galway Kinnell, you know Galway Kinnell. You read Whitman, you know Whitman. You read Yeats, you know Yeats. I mean, they have a cadence to them that I think is almost independent of the meters that they may or may not use. In fact, they're significantly different than other people who are using the same meters. So I don't worry about that too much. So that's how I'm thinking lyric. I was not really happy at one time with confessional poetry either.
Okay.
I thought that it had gone, when I started writing, I was a little tired of having to jump into somebody's personal life or know what pain they are particularly feeling. Now, don't get me wrong, that's the way of sharing, and it's a way of emphasizing or showing it or entering into it. But I was careful. I just wasn't as I was not as enthralled with. I loved Sharon Olds, and I read her, and I thought she was like the best poet in the world, and very confessional. And so it's not that I don't love it. It's just that I didn't want to go that far there.
Right.
So I just didn't. I just developed something different that way.
I have a question on cadence.
Yeah.
Do you ever work or as an exercise practice a disruption in cadence?
Yeah. Well, I think I do that all the time. I will change cadences in my poems. I will do that again with line breaks. I will do it with just the way it sounds. And yes, I do. In fact, I hope mostly it does speed up and slow down in certain places. So, yeah, the metronome is no good to a poet.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking
I think it was that's Pound, isn't it? Trying to break the monotony of the metronome.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the meter is not fixed like that.
Sure. I guess I was referring to how you can read a poet and you know it's them. Do you ever try to practice to get far away from yourself when you're writing, just as an exercise to see if you can sound like something different from how you normally sound?
That's an exercise that you can do. You can try to write if you're... I wouldn't say that I try to do that when I'm writing my poems, but as exercises, sure. I mean, it's a great exercise for people who want to do poetry to write Pound, to write Whitman, to write Emily Dickinson. I mean, write them. Like, God, they're hard. but you can get into you can get into that, and you can kind of see where it goes. It's always in my way of thinking, a bad imitation, but it's
like bands covering other music.
Yeah, but it's certainly something that makes you aware of other cadences and other ways, things that you admire, and they probably sneak into your subconscious someplace along the line. So, anybody who wants to write poetry, you got to read it. Right. And you can't just read one person, and you can't just read one era, and you can. But after you do that for a while, you ought to change and go someplace else for a while.
Well, you can do it.
Yeah.
I'm Case Johnson with Shane Griffiths, and I are talking with Brad Roghaar at Booked on 25th on historic 25th Street in Ogden, Utah. We're talking about poetry, which is, I think we could do it all night long, and I think we probably should. Just bring the drinks, Brandon. Where's the wine? And we'll get going.
The Irish are good.
So we're talking about one-liners, and I love that idea. As a writer myself, if somebody comes up to you and says, God, I just like that one line, you're like, that's awesome. That is so cool that you remembered it. And I think we're speaking of the on that level, and I think of that Caesarean birth of a blade of grass, and I know that's, I'm paraphrasing, but that will stick with me, this image of this kind of cutting up through, just how that, it didn't change the poem, because earlier on we were talking about the same blade of grass breaking through the snow, but it didn't change the aboutness of the poem, but it did change the image of that blade of grass at the very end. But I'm going to shift a little bit and looking at a larger, more question that delves more into our humanity. Where do poets, and in your case the poet laureates, belong today in our society with Netflix and Facebook and social media? And I'm not one I'm not one that looks down on social media. Where do poet laureates belong today?
Well, I think probably poet laureates are, I think their job basically is to promote some kind of poetry that they seem to think is poetry, I suppose, which is usually poet laureates are fairly traditional people. I mean, they're not like picked out of, so Bob Dylan just gets the Nobel Prize in Literature. Mm-hmm. Good. He ought to get it. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is a poet. You can't say that just from like one thing or whatever. He has such a range of work. And if you look at it, it is very new, but it is also awfully traditional in all those ways. So, people who are recognized with those kinds of things, it's because they are steeped in the tradition. I truly believe that, and that's why there'll always be poetry that will be pretty recognizable, because the tradition is there, and new poets talk with that. It's a dialogue with that tradition, so that it's carried forward. It changes. We don't write the same as Milton did, generally speaking. But boy, there's Milton in us. And so it's I don't worry about the health of poetry. It's going to be here forever. It was here forever. I mean, in the beginning, there was let there be light, and there was light. It was, we speak the world into existence. It's the word that speaks the world into existence. It's that important. It's that mysterious. It's that human to us, and always it has a tradition to it. It just changes. So, I don't worry about the health of it. I tell students in my class, we're not taking this poetry class because we're afraid that poetry is going to die someplace. Mm-hmm. It's not going to go anywhere and die. It's going to evolve. It's going to do things, but it's always going to be speaking the way that it has been speaking to people since forever, which is, here it is, here's an interpretation of what it is about to be you, to be human, to be here. So we don't have to worry about it. We just,
I feel I do.
Well, some people do. Rap
true.
music.
Yeah,
What's that going to do? What's rap music? It's poetry. It's about it has all the characteristics of poetry. It takes a certain culture. It takes a certain language with it. It takes the rhythms of that language. It's wonderful stuff. But no, it's not going to evolve into rap music. Rap music's going to be subsumed into poetry. That's how that works. It doesn't work the other way.
So I had a similar question to Case's that is maybe not exactly the same, but overlaps. You did not, plagiarist. But what I was thinking is, what is the function of the poet in the community? But it sounds like you touched on that. And so if I was summarizing what I'm understanding, it would be the function of the poet in the community is to get us in touch with that tradition of poetry and sort of help carry it forward and reinvent it. And then the function of the poet laureate in the larger community is to help introduce those poets to people who may not be as fluent or well versed in the contemporary poetic scene. Is that right?
Yeah,
Would you like to add
introduce
to
them.
it?
Yeah, because I'm saying that I don't know any poet laureates or people of great stature that don't do that. I mean, and that aren't grounded in a tradition, in the tradition. I shouldn't say a tradition, but in the tradition. If you get my drift on what that means, it's accumulated from a long, long time ago, and that makes them uniquely qualified to find individual voices or to understand individual or synthesize those or integrate them or maybe make people see that the tradition isn't, you're not trying to copy that. You just relax and let's, tell me how, why don't you be a poet who captures what you feel and what you see around you. I mean, the rest is automatic. Yeah.
So also helping people find their own voices in poetry.
And I so much want people to read poetry and get out of it, and get things out of it. There's so much there, and not view it as some kind of Grecian urn that's been frozen someplace, or made, and then that's that.
Right.
Yeah.
Or some kind of frivolity,
Right. But, of course, I write a lot of limericks.
Mm-hmm.
I write a lot of poems, occasional poems. I've probably done 20 weddings where I write poems for. I just did one. I just got back from Nashville yesterday. I did one for my, and read it at his wedding. And, of course, I almost always introduce them with some limerick that's funny. That or after the very serious one, have a toast with a limerick that is very funny, because that's the range of poetry. It fits occasions, and But I generally would not write a serious poem in a limerick. I mean, I don't know how I could capture what I want to say. What I would be wanting to do in my other poetry with a limerick.
Yeah, works against that particular tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. But boy, that's a great part of a different thing you might want to say sometime.
So we touched on all my questions. I was looking, I had a mix of a question between landscape and specifically Ogden as landscape that enters into your poetry. And I think we talked about that quite a bit, at least within the natural world here in Utah in the West. But how about, do you find the Ogden as urban instead of Ogden as mountains and as rivers and as streams and as skiing and so on, or rock climbing and so on and so forth? Does that find its way into your poetry as well? This representation of what Ogden, well, maybe Ogden's contradictions, especially with the dog food factory and with, you know, where you have this
The lovely
beautiful,
dog food.
I know, the dog factory, right? And, you know, you have this smell that you wake up to, but it is Ogden. I mean, do you get a mix of the city and the Ogden's contradictions? Do they show up in your poetry?
I think Ogden is unique and also a typical city. I am not as interested in urban landscape as I am in natural landscape. I think that's just the nature of what I do and you know, where I am most of the time. But there's a vibrancy always in an urban area. I mean, you also need, in poetry, you need a vibrancy of an audience within an urban area. That's where most poetry maybe not comes from, but certainly gets a hold and lives with people, where people gather in urban environments. And of course, the diversity of what I've been talking about, I mean to be talking about, is that the diversity of those voices are all part of the milieu in which poetry is filtered and rises and falls and is eventually picked up in the tradition or not or whatever. But so the people as gathering someplace is very, very important, and that means, you know, pretty urban. I mean, although, you know, I have lots of cowboy poet people who, they're not particularly all that pastoral in a lot of ways, although you could relate it to that. But they certainly are a group, although they don't live in an urban area, they live in this urban area. They live right out there in Plain City or in Far West or whatever, or right here in Ogden. And they have a voice. And they're very good, by the way. There's several very good poets here. If you want to just talk about my job, is to find the stakeholders in the community that have a stake in what is being said, what they want to say, and give them that platform. So that's very important. And so I won't, as I go around trying to do what I do, the first thing I do is find, okay, who cares? And who's not included? And if the more I can find who cares and the more I can find that are not included or who are waiting to be included, the better all the work that people are doing is going to be known. And so right here in Ogden, I've already started writing a poem for the Mayor's Awards. I'm sorry, it's very difficult for me. No, it's not difficult for me to rewrite the poem, but it's difficult for me to escape my own head. So my first poem is about the confluence of these two rivers. Now, I don't know. It's just, to me, that's the metaphor of what you're talking about, with a mixture, with a diversity of people, and two become one, but that is really many. And it's a geographical, it's a landscape reason that Ogden exists. And it also has a history with the fur traders. I mean, you know, we could go on, and it brings the blood of everybody down there that's ever passed through it. So, you know, that's how I justify that, you know, and it is the reason you have an urban setting here. And the same thing with the physical junction of a railroad. I mean, it's the same thing, junctions. Conjunctions. And so my poem is automatically going there. On the other hand, I'm working on another one because it's the mayor's awards in the arts. This is going to talk about arts. Now, arts are a diversity of people. So I'm hoping I can get a little bit more people into that one. But yeah, it's something that you always. I don't really. Again, I'm not too concerned about whether my poetry will reflects what I see and what I do, and I do have a hard time sometimes relating to a lot of. A lot of poetry that just doesn't speak to me so much because it's not who it's interesting maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it just doesn't interest me, because it's not familiar enough to me.
Well, and jumping off from that, it's always struck me that in some ways the subject matter chooses the poet in a way, like different poets are going to be drawn towards writing about different material. And we talked about how the natural world shows up in yours, and clearly that's something that calls you to write about it. Right. And I was thinking about this because I know we have a lot of writers who listen, and this is something that I've thought about as well. How do you determine, or how do you distinguish a thought from a poem? Like something that you're just like, oh, that's curious. Or, when do you start feeling like, I got to write this thing down?
Boy, that's the juncture. That's the juncture when you start writing it down, I think, is the metamorphosis between a thought and a physical thing. Mm-hmm. And I have a hard time doing that. I tend to write a lot of notes to myself, and they're scattered all over the place. Thoughts, things that I want to pursue. Uh-huh. And I don't have the patience or at that point or whatever. So what it usually requires is that I all of a sudden have a reason to write one. Mm-hmm. And then I sift through all that stuff until I hit on something, and then there it goes, but that's the juncture that it becomes a poem when you're no longer interested in just thinking about it, but you're interested in codifying it in a sense, and you're interested in sharing it in a way that can't be done one-on-one maybe, or two-on-two, or at a party or whatever, but there's the fodder for everything you're doing, and you talk about what's interesting you to people, and you hear other things back, and you catch some of that in that strainer up there. And then, but that's the juncture. The juncture is simply when you say, now I want to write about it. Now I'm codifying it. I want to write about it. And I find it difficult. I'm not the kind of person who gets up every, 9 o'clock and goes up and, although I'm getting closer to that. Get us up 9 o'clock and works from 9 till 11 on a poem. It's difficult I almost have to have a deadline, like, the mayor's award, you got to write a poem. Okay, I'll get it done, which works for me, I guess.
I like the idea of the mind as a strainer, and something's just going to wash away, and something is going to be left in the sieve, and what's left there, you start working with.
Well, I know you're familiar with this, Shane. When you wake up with a great thought, 2 a.m, and you write it down, and then you get too tired, and and then you get up and you can't even use it. It's so
right?
bad.
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. But that's a good exercise too. You throw all that stuff in. But there is a very considered, purposeful part of writing. Uh-huh. It's not just going from thought to thought. Writing forces form on something. Mm-hmm. And so that's what a poem becomes. It may come from a lot of different things, but it is a poem when it's written.
Right.
When it's, and
when it's shaped and
and
molded,
too when it's published.
Mm-hmm.
If you get something published, then it's done.
Right.
You're finished. You can't redo it. Yeah. That's beautiful. That's a wonderful thing, because I'll redo things forever.
Me too.
Or just, I'll have a poem, and then I'll use I'm writing another one. I'll use one from that poem because it just seems to fit. And you can't do that when you publish them.
Yeah.
So
I'd actually really like to go back and change things that I've published quite a bit.
oh,
It's like, oh.
Don't you do that in your book? I sometimes will like,
Oh,
at
yeah,
least in my copy,
well, yeah,
like that
me
word
too.
doesn't
Yeah.
need to be there.
Yeah, I've got my book. Well, for readings, oh yeah, it's totally.
I don't, but then I don't publish a whole bunch, and the to me, when I don't like something that I did, I just go, well, that's not me.
Yeah,
That
that's
was
good.
that was then.
That was
this
me
is
then.
now.
then,
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So I'm pretty willing to, when I give it up, to give it up, and then it's got its own life.
Yeah.
When they make your novel into a movie, which I think they ought to.
Oh,
Shane.
sure. I think they ought
You're
to
just-
too. I'm ready
You're
for the
just gonna
paycheck. But
I've talked to a lot of authors, and I'll tell you, the best thing you can do is just let that go,
exactly.
because it's going to be a different form of art. It's not a novel. It's not a poem. It's a movie. It's not a play. It's a movie.
Right.
And those things, everybody I talk to say, just let them go,
Yeah.
because everybody should know that it's not you or what you did. That's what a lot of my friends say, will read things and think, well, I didn't know you thought you were so sensitive or whatever, or that you would think those things or whatever, or how do you dare say those things, And my answer to that is, well, my poem is not me.
That's right.
It's just simply not me. It's a product that I have produced.
Mm-hmm.
And is it devoid of me? No way. It can't be. But it isn't me.
Yeah.
And so I don't have to interpret that bad. So when people say, if people are saying, I hate that poem, I don't like, that's a stupid idea, I just say, yeah, well, I just threw it out.
I can't believe anybody would say
Yeah.
that. Not to you.
Well, not to my face, but I'm thinking that there are a lot of people who look at something and say, "Holy moly, what is that? And how does that work? And are you kidding?" But I'm pretty immune to that, because it's not me. I make a difference between a product and myself.
I think that's wise.
I do too. I think I need to practice that a
Yeah.
lot more. I was saying that if I keep too many of the things that I shouldn't in my brain, and let the things go that I should, but I'm keeping this one. Well, I want to say thanks again. Thanks, Shane, for joining us again, and thanks, Brad, for your poetry, for sharing the poetry at first, and then talking about it with us. It was great.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm sure you. I'm much more happy about it than you are.